Thank you, Tim. I was talking to a guy that pretty smart, very measured, very calm. And I said, I'm so excited that Tim Noakes is coming to our conference. And he said, yeah, I don't really, Tim Noakes, the fittest person I know went on the Tim Noakes diet. He cut out carbohydrates and he got very sick. How do you answer that kind of criticism? Because certainly one of the big points that came out of this was that we must find out what our individual carbohydrate tolerance is. So if this person cut out carbohydrates completely and then got very sick, what was that telling?
Well, I'd ask what was the diagnosis of sickness. For example, you can get gallstones. And that's because your gallbladder has never been working. And so you develop all these stones on a high carbohydrate diet. Now you introduce fat and all of a sudden the gallbladder starts contracting, it expels the stones and you get pancreatitis or serious condition. So absolutely, but that wasn't caused by the high-fat diet. It was caused by the high-carbohydrate diet, and it's exposed. I mean, how could we write a book like that showing that the low-carbohydrate diet is the most studied diet in the world? And there's no evidence that when you put people on this diet, that happens. So he's an imitation scientist. Where's the evidence? Please find it. One person, it's an anecdote. He could have had some other condition that happened to occur at the same time.
But he's blaming you.
Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah. You're a bit like Helen Ziller. You're a bit of a lightning rod.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, so, again, you have to ask, what was the diagnosis and what's the evidence that the diet changed, that the diet caused the change?
Tim, in my career, I've met a lot of people and they've said a lot of things, but not all of them live it. I know you live it because I've visited you.
Yes.
And I've seen your library.
Yeah.
How many books do you read? How many books do you own? And what kind of...
Oh, thousands, but I read widely. And again, that's because I always want to find out what's this truth.
The biggest feeling that I get from everything that you discussed today is that the body is an incredible machine.
Yeah.
Is that where your starting point is?
Yeah, and the key is you have to understand evolution or creation. I don't mind which you believe in. You either believe that God created the human in this format and animals in a different format, or you believe that we evolved. And it doesn't make any difference what you believe. But what we know is our body is designed to eat fat and protein. That's what it's evolved to do. And now if you want the evolutionary explanation, you go back 2 million years, 3 million years, when humans were killing elephants, rhinoceroses, hippopotamus. That's what they were eating. And we've got the evidence, and I could have shown it to you. What they look for is cut marks on bones. So they find these fossilized bones where they know humans or pre-humans have existed. And the most recent paper was, again, 2 weeks ago, where they found that hippopotamus were killed by Paranthropus, which, if you believe the evolutionary story, Paranthropus existed on the planet 3 million years ago. And Paranthropus was not massive. He probably 5 foot, maybe a bit more. They were killing hippopotamus, and the evidence is absolutely clear. And what happened, humans ate these very fat animals, and I'll explain why perhaps, until we got rid of all of them. So that the reason you don't see big fat animals anymore, or big fat antelope, because they were wiped out by humans. And then we had to find a substitute, and carbohydrates were the substitute. But our body wasn't designed to cope with carbohydrates, with this load I showed you, this huge glucose load. We're designed to metabolize gently the protein and the fat and absorb it without getting these spikes, which cause the insulin, which causes the obesity and the diabetes. And so that's how we evolved, or that's how we were created. And so you've got to understand, and if you're not prepared to read back the history of how humans were created or evolved, you're going to miss the story completely. And that's what happens. That's why imitation scientists don't bother, because they're being paid to give a different story. So it doesn't matter whether they know about evolution, creation, and so on. That's not important to them.
So if you just get out of the way, in many instances, your body will sort things out.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, that's why the low-carb diet has taken off, is because people try it. And you saw the guy who lost 85 kilograms. Do you think he thinks the old diet was good? No, it's once you do it and you change, you realize, my gosh, how could I have done this for so long without realizing I was killing myself?
Why is it called banting?
Oh, Banting was an obese mortician in London in the 1840s. And he, in fact, laid out Wellington. When Wellington died, he had to prepare his body and put it in Westminster Abbey and so on. But he had the contract to bury all the kings and queens. But he was obese. And he was wealthy, obviously. And he tried everything. For 20 years, he tried everything possible. He even bought a rowing boat and used to row up and down the Thames. And he said all it helped him was got a giant hunger from all this rowing. He didn't lose 1 pound. So eventually, he loses his hearing. And he goes to a doctor. And the doctor says, the reason you can't hear is because there's too much fat in your ears, you see. You've got to get rid of the fat. And fortunately, the doctor had just been to a lecture in Paris given by Claude Bernard, who was the great physiologist who discovered glycogen, which we spoke about the other day. And Claude Bernard said, I think that obesity and diabetes have got something to do with carbohydrates. He didn't know what it was, but he said it's got something to do with it. So the doctor advising Banting said, your problem is you're eating too much carbohydrate. You've got to cut the carbs. We didn't say that, but you know what I mean. And so he cut the carbs and he lost his 20 kilograms and his life changed completely and he lived to 85, I think it was. And he wrote a book. And he then republished it 3 or 4 times because it was so successful. And that book went around the world, and it's the first diet book, and it's called Letters on Corpulence. And the medical profession got very angry that he was giving medical advice to the world. The diet then went to Germany. A Dr. Epstein took the diet to Germany and modified it. It never got to America because what happened in America was a very famous Arctic explorer went and lived in the Arctic, got lost in the Arctic and lived with the Inuit for 10 years and ate their diet, which is high fat, high protein, no carbs. Came back to New York and he said, I'm not going to eat the food you're eating. And the guy said, well, you're going to die if you eat that diet because it's not got vitamin C, blah, blah, blah. So he said, why don't you hospitalize me and we'll see. So he was hospitalized for 3 months and nothing happened. He didn't die. And the physicians were surprised. So they said, okay, we'll let you out for the next 9 months, but you're not allowed to eat any carbs. You've got to keep eating this meat diet. And so he did. And at the end of a year, he was in perfect health and they published that. Fortunately, a physician saw that and then introduced that diet to a new group of New York patients and wrote it up in the Journal of American Medical Association. And his name was Pennington. And that brought the banting diet via the Arctic to New York. And that's kind of when it took off. And then Atkins comes along in the 1970s and does very well. And then he dies. And people say, yes, he died because of the diet. And then the diet fell again. And then when Eric Westman wrote that book that changed my life, that started to pick up. And it's interesting that now the diet is obviously is fully researched and we have the evidence that it works.
And it's so mainstream that you can get banting rusks.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't eat them.
Okay, so they're not really banting rusks.
No. When I started my scientific career, the first thing we were looking at was trying to disprove that marathon runners would have immortal, they become immortal. They never have heart disease. So I used to travel around South Africa, picking up the hearts of runners who died in races and bringing them back for analysis. And it took me 4 years to find a case where we could prove that the person had a heart attack. And so we disproved that hypothesis. But it took me 4 years.
You have mentioned a lot about imitation scientists.
Yeah.
And we know that when we want to catch politicians who've been on the take, we have lifestyle audits. Perhaps that's an opportunity to look at. You mentioned a Ferrari. I hope that was just a joke. But if you have informal lifestyle audits of academics that you know, do you see the evidence of them being supported by those whose agendas they promote?
Yeah, I think you have to ask Nick that question because he's addressed that question. And Panda's published data on looking at who's being funded by what. I think that the point I made yesterday was that, and Asim mentioned this, that in the 1980s, the funding of universities changed from being provided by government to being provided by industry. And if you get them, because I was deeply involved in this, raising money for doing carbohydrate research, and 20% of the money we raised went to the university and to the faculty, and the faculty used that to keep the faculty going. And that's great, because they do provide services and they should take their 20%. But the problem is they become very dependent on that 20% to keep their standards up. And that 20% now, if it comes from industry who want to influence the professors to say certain things, becomes very difficult. And I think in my case, when I said that diabetes is a pandemic and we need to stop it, and then I get attacked by the professors who are deeply involved in the pharmaceutical industry, you have to ask, were they being told to attack me, or did they do it because they thought I was a threat to South Africa's health?
A very quick one. We couldn't get hold of your original book, the book that you showed, The Challenging Beliefs, anywhere. What about a reprint?
Yeah, they didn't want to reprint it. I think it's, maybe I'll have to rewrite another chapter on COVID or something, which will make it even more unacceptable. But
who's the publisher?
Who are the publishers?
Doesn't matter.
Yeah, I'll get me.
But BizNews can publish books,
Well, then, let's think about it. Yeah, let's think about it.
There we go. Something new from the conference. Again, who's first?
Hi, morning. I'm Claire Dubourg. I've just got one question with regards to Alzheimer's, dementia, being called diabetes type 3, if you could just elaborate on that.
The fabulous book written by Dr. Chris Palmer called Brain Energy. And he said, this is a psychiatrist from Harvard. He spends his life prescribing the normal treatments for all those conditions you described. One day he's got a patient with bipolar disease, and the patient is grossly obese, and he says to Dr. Palmer, I really appreciate you treating my bipolarism, but I'm also obese. Can't you help me? He said, of course, low-carb diet, blah, blah, blah. And he really does it very well, and the guy loses all his weight. And then 6 months later, his bipolar disease disappears. So Dr. Palmer says, oh my gosh, this is now 6 years ago. He says, oh my gosh, maybe the diet's got something to do with mental disease. And so he's written this book, which claims, or which develops the hypothesis, should we say, that all mental disorders are a brain energy problem, and they all come back to insulin resistance, the condition which I have, and which I spoke about and showed you that all the different diseases related to insulin resistance. And there's a growing movement that if you have mental disorders, you definitely need to be on the ketogenic diet, because the ketone bodies provide the brain with extra energy instead of glucose. So if you're eating a high carbohydrate diet, your brain ultimately becomes resistant to glucose. And so glucose, which is normally the main fuel for the brain, can't be used. And as you age, your brain gets less and less energy, and that is considered probably an important cause of dementia. But you can get around it to some extent if you provide ketone bodies, and you provide ketone bodies by eating a low carbohydrate diet or fasting. Those are the two treatments. So thanks for asking that question. Yes, there's a very strong evidence that insulin resistance is strongly linked to mental disorders.
Tim, isn't it amazing? The power went off and on again, and you never missed it.
John Allen. Quick story. I visit a friend. I'm dying. I've got excess cholesterol. What's your number? I'm 5.3. Let's go and have a look at it on the internet. I try and look for it. I take 3 search engines. I finally find the graph. It started back then at 7. It's now at 5, and she's at 5.3. We're going to have a look at the graph on statins, and it's a hockey stick. Right? I just like comment on where the numbers have gone. And
yeah, when I was training in medicine, Chris Barnard lectured to us. He said the normal cholesterol is 7.5. And he was a cardiac surgeon. And the first patient he operated on, first heart transplant, guess what disease the patient had? Diabetes. The second patient he operated on before heart failure, diabetes. It wasn't cholesterol. So cholesterol is not the causa vera. So you can throw it out. You don't have to worry about it. What you have to worry about is your fasting insulin. your HDL cholesterol, and your triglycerides. And there are values there that are important. At my age, the higher your cholesterol, the longer you live. How can it be at 60, all of a sudden, you turn 65, and then a cholesterol of 9, which was meant to kill you, is not going to prevent you, is going to help you live for your life for a long time. Cholesterol is a crucial component of your body. Your brain is a lot of cholesterol in the brain, and if you're taking statins, you're stopping the production of cholesterol, which is vital. God did not make the liver to produce cholesterol to kill you. God gave you a liver to produce cholesterol to make you live.
Wow.
Hello, Tim. Thanks for your talk. It's Keith. I'm curious about the word addiction when you talk to sugar and processed foods. And it links for me psychology and some readings I've done in the last year. Tim Noakes and Bessel van der Kolk were both physicians and have identified a link, they say, between pharmacology and psychology. And their argument is that doctors have been trained in pharmacology, but not in whole medicine. And I was wondering your view on it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a real issue, that we become so finding the drug that's going to help you that we don't look at your lifestyle and all those psychological issues as well. That's very important. But clearly, sugar is highly addictive, and it acts the same parts of the brain as cocaine and heroin and so on. And so the pathways are identical. And we know that. I mean, if you take people with sugar addiction and try to take it away, it takes a long, long time. And the biggest failure of the banting diet is in people who don't get over the addiction. And we found in a group of 28 people who claimed that the diabetes had been reversed on the banting diet, when we looked at them, the majority had indeed reversed their type 2 diabetes, but the small group who hadn't were the ones who couldn't control their addiction for sugar, and they continued to eat sugar and ultra-processed foods. So the reversal of type 2 diabetes requires that you've got to sort out the food addiction. It's the first priority.
Hi, Tim. Possibly I don't understand the problem, but why are people who suffer from diabetes, why are they given insulin injections?
Oh, good. Thank you very much. That's a great question. And the reason is because insulin could be measured in the 1970s. And so when insulin was discovered, it was discovered in 1920, but it could only be measured in your bloodstream in the 1970s. So for this period of 50 years, we were treating patients with diabetes with insulin, which works very well in type 1 diabetes because they haven't got enough insulin. And everyone assumed that type 2 diabetics like myself don't have enough insulin, so we pumped in the insulin. And it worked because it lowers your glucose, but it doesn't affect your long-term outcomes, which they realized quite soon, that giving insulin to a type 2 diabetic didn't really improve their life expectancy, although it did get their glucose down. And only now, more recently, have people suddenly started to realize when you go on the low-carbohydrate diet, you don't require your insulin. And then the idea of insulin resistance has become more and more popular. So my problem is not that I'm not producing enough insulin. The insulin doesn't work. My tissues have said, we've had enough of that insulin. You've been over-secreting for 30 years eating this high-carbohydrate diet. We've had enough. We're switching off. So the insulin spikes, but it doesn't produce the desired effect. And that is insulin resistance. Now, you can overcome it slightly by giving insulin, but that doesn't help in the long term. So the reason why insulin is given to patients with type 2 diabetes is because we didn't understand the mechanism was different than in type 1 diabetes. And that took a long time to get into the literature and for people to realize it. So to summarize, type 1 don't have enough insulin, they need insulin. Type 2 diabetics are over-secreting insulin, but it's not. And they are given insulin because it gets the glucose down, and that people thought, well, that's fantastic, but it doesn't really work. You've got to get the glucose down by not feeding the glucose to yourself. That's the easiest way to get the glucose down.
Last question.
Okay. Prof. Noakes, I think you have a blind spot in the form of the gut bacteria and you know, the book that Dr. Natasha Campbell McBride, for instance, wrote on microbiome and gut bacteria. I think it plays a huge role, and I don't see comment on that.
Sure, no. By the way, she sent me a book because not to educate me, but as a saying thank you for what you're doing for the discipline. So absolutely, I agree with you. The problem with the microbiome studies is that as it's currently appearing in the literature, the people like myself who are carnivores or don't eat much carbohydrate, we go and look at the Hansa people who also eat meat, and we look at their bacteria and say, you see, they've got the perfect bacteria in the gut because it fits my paradigm. Whereas the vegans and the vegetarians go along and they study the vegan-vegetarian population and say, you see, this is the perfect biome. That's the problem. I don't know that we yet know what the perfect biome is. That it affects you is unbelievably true, and your mood is so strongly linked to what you're eating and the microbiome that you have. So I don't contest it. I just say that it's still in the early days of development.
So you haven't got a blind spot, or you have a blind spot, but you're looking at it.
Yes,
Nothing about it.
that's it. Yeah.
Professor Tim Noakes, it's been wonderful having you here today. Thank you again. Let's give him a warm round of applause.